Okay. Ooh, cute. The Wi-Fi went down.
Shante?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not seeing you.
Let me.
I'm not seeing anybody.
Oh,
I'm going to come out and try to come back in. Hello? Let me try again. I just wasn't having any video.
the Wi-Fi is very shifty at the moment.
Okay. This is, I'm seeing you now.
Okay. Or you want me to, I love everybody in and then you start.
Yeah, let me.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay.
Welcome to
David is back.
All right.
Hi, Nadeen.
Hi, David.
Yeah.
Caroline is here, David is here, and Helene is here.
Yes. So,
You want me to be on video?
If you want to be, if you can, if you want to be, if you're ready. Some people might not want to show their faces. I'm making sure my hair is okay.
I'm not sure about
You're not sure about your face?
No, my background. Me itch up on the bed because we just rush in and me no have a proper background.
It's okay. As long as you're comfortable with it. Hi, Lynette. You see, Lynette wasn't showing her face, you know. Lynette, we caught a glimpse, but only a glimpse.
Are you seeing me?
I'm seeing your roof or your wall, but I'm not seeing you.
But I not see it. How me know if me are sure?
it'll pop up on your screen. There'll be multiple.
I'm seeing those. I'm seeing you. I'm seeing Nadeen and all these little boxes.
But
I'm putting on video, but I'm not seeing. It doesn't matter.
Look for your face.
Yeah, Mr. Where my name is, I'm seeing my name, but I'm not seeing it's the blank. So I don't know why it's showing the wall.
It's a you have to adjust it, bring it down so that your face is in the screen.
No man. Oh, you know what happened? I didn't put when it says to join with video, I didn't click that, but there's the video thing down the bottom, and I click on it, which it took the X thing off of it. So I'm assuming it's working.
It's working, man. It's just how you've positioned the camera.
Oh, I know that. I forget some up paper over my camera.
Over the camera. That was my question.
I hide from all the spies who are going to sneak in on me. Oh, see it there now.
Okay.
So when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. This is, would you believe it? This is our 5th COVID-19 conversations. And by saying this is our 5th, of course, you would have recognized that there were 4 more conversations that we had on a number of other issues that we thought were critical for us as a society to speak to. The first one, which was chaired by Maziki Fame, looked at the new economy, looking at some realities that COVID-19 had caused us to want to think through again. The second one was women and the COVID-19 pandemic, which was like an eye-opener in respect of how women on the front line, as I call it, are dealing with the challenges of COVID-19. And the third one was looking at COVID-19 and education. And of course, we would have known that with the closing down of schools and with the need to continue education remotely or online, it had caused several challenges to the continuing of education in Jamaica, and not just Jamaica, globally too. And last week, our fourth conversation was on COVID-19 and health. And in that conversation, there was a look at the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health Strategic Action Plan, and how that action plan looks now that we're looking at Jamaica through the lens of a health pandemic. And so it has been quite a tour de force. The issues we've been exploring, and the ideas that we've been amassing, and how, as a community of women, and because that's who we are planning these talks, we are in a way putting together an agenda around COVID-19. And of course, the original intention was to seek to influence the COVID-19 task force, economic recovery task force, by raising what we thought were critical issues. So this week we turn our attention to COVID-19 and the labor market, and to talk about, how COVID-19 has impacted the Jamaican labor market, one. Two, how the Jamaican labor market responded to COVID-19. And, of course, looking at the challenges, looking at the impact, and then also looking at the possibilities going forward, where there's room for change, where there's room for growth, where certainly there is room for innovation as it relates to employers, employment, the workplace, and so on. So I have three people who would help me to speak to some of these issues this afternoon. And we have Mr. David Wan, who is president of the Jamaica Employers Federation. Dr. Carolyn Graham, who is a specialist in the sociology of work, and who, because of this particular situation that we're in called COVID-19, I will introduce as a former registrar of seafarers in Jamaica with the Maritime Authority. And Mrs. Helene Davis White, who is president of the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions. So I wanted to just start by saying a number of things around COVID-19 related to the labor market have stood out to me during this time. Of course, we know that one of the constant concerns we hear is that there is no massive unemployment as a result of the response to COVID-19, the closing down of the borders, the stay-at-home work order in some cases, businesses that had to close their doors because of the response to COVID-19, and generally because of a general slowdown in the global economy. All other countries around the world were engaged in this activity. The need for social distancing, all of the results of trying to deal with COVID-19. There were other issues that came up as a result of that. Safety in the workplace, and I'm sure that all of us know that infamous phrase, that workplace cluster, the now famous Alarica, and what our own conversations were about work during COVID-19 and the safety of the employee, and how we create more equitable spaces for all of us to work. Issues of contract work, security of tenure, the quality of work and the attendant remuneration, employee representation in the workplace, the new order of work and what it means for people who have to work without security of tenure. Of late, for me and for Helene and some of the other women on this um, talk this evening, has been looking at Lynette as well. It has been looking at domestic workers and the reality that the arrangements under which they work makes them very vulnerable to just the harsh realities, the harshest perhaps realities of the pandemic. And then in all of that are the realities of those Jamaicans who were at sea during at the beginning of the crisis, and the result of that conversation, which resulted in a national conversation about Jamaicans being left back home and Jamaicans caught at sea, and then the very private reality of a woman who had a miscarriage on a ship and how that became part of our national public political discourse. Those are all issues that stood out for me in very profound ways. I think the other one would have been what is happening along the tourism corridor and the invocation by the Ministry of Tourism that 350,000 tourism employees have lost their work. So I want us to just turn our attention to those considerations as we deliberate for the next hour. And so I want to ask our panelists to assess for me their own assessment to respond to their own assessment of COVID-19 and its impact on the Jamaican labour market, just as a first goal. And we'll start with David, and I'm just calling in line of how you're lined up on my screen. So it's David first, Caroline, and then Helene. What is your assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on the Jamaican labour market?
All right. I thought you were going to say it's because you're going alphabetically and my name starts with D. You know.
Could be.
Anyway, it's good to be here to share with you. And I thank you for the invitation. The COVID-19 has impacted not only Jamaica, but the world in many, many different spheres. Labor and workplace being one of them. But just let me say, to start off with the big picture, there's been economic impact, there's been legal ramifications, and there's been safety concerns in the workplace, as well as in your own home and your daily comings and goings. And there's also been a revolution in our personal habits in order for us to keep ourselves safe from infection. There's a new order of work, as you mentioned, where previously it was thought that not many jobs could be done remotely, but there's a new thinking now that many jobs can be done remotely. Unfortunately, there's a categories of jobs that simply cannot be done remotely. That is if you're involved in direct customer service or providing a good to somebody, logistics, etc. Those can't be done remotely. There's also, you mentioned the domestic workers. Not only have they been impacted by COVID, but they're also in the position where the occupational safety and health, I don't think enough consideration has been given to them as a group in the crafting of the occupational safety and health. Other challenges were brought out for this domestic worker group, even in the smoking legislation, you know, that the home is a workplace. Therefore, if the employer wanted to smoke, the person, you know, could claim that somebody's smoking and they refuse to work, all those kinds of issues. So I point that out because you had mentioned them as a group, Nadeen, and I think the formation of the Household Workers Union has gone a long way to help that group, but they are definitely challenged, and COVID is no exception to those challenges that face this group. As far as the workplace, drilling down a little bit, I think many of the norms we're used to have been tested. For example, the whole concept of safety at work. What used to be thought of as janitorial type activities have now become sanitization, which is a whole different thing from simply keeping your workplace clean. And the protective equipment that puts a burden on the employers because they usually provide it. And the PPE is provided by the employees, but there's a whole menu of things coming to change the workplace. For example, reconfiguring workstations so there's at least 4 square meters per person, especially in the call centers, which tend to be very densely populated. The coming and going from your workplace, subject to temperature checks and forced, I would want to say, involuntary sanitization of your hands, although it's a good thing. I shouldn't say it in a bad way. And also, the workplace, one of the challenges facing the employers is that even if you are compliant with all the new infection prevention and control protocols issued by the Ministry of Health or the World Health Organization, you also have the chain, I call it, from workers, employees, home to a transport center, back to your place of employment, even if you're compliant and the transport center is not following best practices, or the person doesn't follow best practices at home, then you're still at risk in terms of the workplace, because employees could conceivably bring the virus into your workplace, which you think is very well protected in terms of the infection protocols. So, there's a layer of complexity that's added. The new order of work, I think a lot more persons than used to work remotely are now working remotely. Typically, it was salespeople as well as other kinds of persons who didn't need to be in the office. But I'm seeing more and more accounting staff who are sent soft copies of documents by email, and they are able to log on via VPN into the company's computer systems and do their jobs. I see marketing people, creative people, graphics people, a lot of them working from home successfully. So, that's a little bit of a touch on several different areas of the workplace. And the bottom line for me is that tremendous change has been forced upon employers because of COVID. And I still don't think 100% of the employers we deal with are fully prepared to be in compliance with all the Ministry of Health protocols just yet. They are working their way to it. In some cases, it's a resource issue for the small and micro employers. And in other cases, it's, you have 40 branches to do the same kinds of changes to the teller station. So it's not something you can just do overnight. So some of those are some of my thoughts, Nadeen, about the changes to the workplace. A quick broad brush.
All right, David, thanks. Caroline.
Yes, thanks for having me, Nadine, and good afternoon to everybody else. The thing that stood out for me, and because it came very close to home as I was also involved myself in terms of my job, but 3 main points: health and safety at work, precariously employed workers, and remote working without support. So in terms of precariously employed people, Nadine mentioned a couple of the features in terms of you're working on contract, your job is not secure, you have is either temporary, you're employed temporary, you have these contracts that you're being, it's rolled over, but you do not have the security of a permanent employee. And the distinction that we have made in the laws now about whether you're an employee versus a worker, and then the worker now having no access to some of the rights that a permanent full-time employee would have. So contract workers, they disguised self-employed people, persons who are agency employed, where you do not have a direct relationship with the employer. Those persons were the first to see, let's say, the first victims then of COVID, because when offices are being closed and businesses are being closed, those are the ones who, I mean, they are let go without any obligation on the part of the employer. And that's the nature of that type of employment that we call precarious employment, why even some persons have been so much, let's use the word against loosely, that type of informal, well, not informal, insecure employment. Then the health and safety at work, because again, my area is health and safety. So I was also concerned about how do we know, we have seen another dimension to health and safety that we never talked about or never even contemplated before. I went to one sitting of the discussion of the health and safety bill. So I know we are discussing it. And one, it's taking way too long. And two, important elements that are, that would be significant for people in these times. We have no laws to either protect us or give us any amount of security or give us any grounds on which we can refuse to do certain things. So whereas we had persons saying they're not comfortable with going to work because people are still being asked to go to work, those who couldn't work remotely, and what are the measures in place? And do workers have the right now to refuse dangerous work? Because the refusal of dangerous work is an important part of any health and safety bill. But because we don't have the laws in place, plus this is an unprecedented event, how do we now deal with workers having this right to say, I'm not going to go to work, or I do not want to go to work because I do not have the proper protective equipment, we're not giving sanitary, we're not following the protocols basically. And of course you're going to know there are going to be employers who are not going to be doing that. The other thing too is we're working remotely without support. Now, I am a lecturer, part-time employed, so with this, you know, when my contract is up, employer has no obligation, I'm just on my own. Plus, it was a very sudden decision to say we're going to close this organization, so to speak. But we're still supposed to continue teaching and doing all the things that we're supposed to do to finish up the semester. And you got no support. There was no correspondence coming from the organization to find out if you have email. You just assume that you have internet, you're on the internet, you have a working computer, and you're just left on your own to carry on as best as you can. So those kinds of things came upon us, yes, suddenly, but they were not discussed, and perhaps the persons in the positions of power to make decisions or management to really show that we're thinking about certain things. You know, let's say they were caught off guard as well. But this assumption that you're just left up, whether you want to pay for Zoom or not, or what other platform, but you were told you had to finish the semester. So others, I'm sure, were in that position to say you're working remotely, but what is the support? And working from home as well in terms of health and safety. Do you have proper working area, proper seat, desk at home? How is your home set up? Do you have the space? You have children. Do you have a space you can go aside someplace to do your work while, you know, you're in your 1 room, 2 room kind of a situation? So there were a lot of things left hanging. And going forward, these are things unprecedented, unforeseen, that we have to start thinking about in the event we have something else like this. Or of course, as the gentleman said, COVID is going to change a lot of how we operate. So how do we go forward and think of all the little things?
Anya, David.
Pardon?
Helen, David.
Judith, we're hearing you, Judith. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yes, I was finished basically.
Yeah, all right. Helene?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to see if my bandwidth will allow for me to keep my video on for a little chat. I think the first impact of COVID would have been unemployment. Not UNEM, but ON employment. In that a number of sectors were adversely affected because of the requirement for social distancing, as well as the safety and health considerations linked to COVID-19. So that any sector that depended on interaction between employees and clients would have been severely affected as a result of COVID. So the first sector that we would have identified is tourism and related entities, because sometimes when we speak about tourism, we forget that there are other aspects to tourism other than hotels. So we're talking about attractions and restaurants and bars that may serve the hotel industry as well. And these were one of the first areas that we would have recognized that the impact as a result of COVID. So most of these either had to close or had to reduce their interaction with clients in a significant way, and as a result of which workers would have been laid off. I must make the point though that there was a meeting of the Labour Advisory Council very early in the day, even before Jamaica closed its borders, where the tripartite, that is the unions and they, as well as the government, really looked at what was likely to be happening. And we recognize they're looking at the possibility of workers having to quarantine, that you're going to face severe problems because workers who are living, basically most of us live one paycheck away from poverty. And so anybody who has to depend on that paycheck, if they are told that they have to quarantine, they are not going to be too eager to serve that quarantine period, recognizing that they would not be paid. And so that's one of the reasons why we would have come out of a Labour Advisory Council meeting with a recommendation that the government needed to put in place a program that would allow workers to continue to be paid, at least in the initial stages of the pandemic. And so came the CARE program, which we know didn't solve everything and certainly was not sufficient in terms of the amounts that it paid, but it still made assisted many persons in terms of their unemployment status, as well as if they had to quarantine, that they would have been able to collect wages. Another area that was heavily impacted would have been any area that provided personal services. So we're looking at barbers, hairdressers, nail techs, all of those would have been severely impacted as well. Most of these were actually self-employed persons, but some were actually employed to various employers across the island. And also schools would have been impacted because of the closure of schools. Granted, the majority of schools in Jamaica are owned and operated by the government of Jamaica. And so there was a vast majority of our teachers, they did not face unemployment. But I know in independent schools, I'm actually on the board of a prep school, and we had a real difficult time because the parents are unable to pay, or in some instances, some of them said that they are unable to pay, and without the fees, it means that the school would be unable to operate, and so independent schools would have faced a severe problem. And of course, just as Carolyn said earlier, it resulted as well in a work from home kind of operation of some schools, which didn't actually take account of the circumstances of the teachers and of the students in many instances. So if we were to look at what was happening in the public school system, I would say, if I were to hazard a guess, probably 80% of the children in the public school system really had no school going on, although they were supposed to be doing it via the internet. The other group that would have been severely impacted arising from COVID would have been I said restaurants already, daycare centers, and those, in terms of workers, those who are classified as contract workers, because contract workers are usually the first call when you are doing any kind of layoff or cutbacks in organizations. And unfortunately, a lot of employers in the last decade or so had shifted from the regular permanent employment to contract employment. And so persons who were employed as contract workers would have been affected. Our household workers, because they're also in that personal service category, would have been affected as well, because many of them, and I probably would think a majority, nobody wanted in the period of the lockdown, nobody wanted anybody into their homes, and so they would have been affected. In terms of the occupational safety and health aspect to it, COVID also would have brought to the fore the whole issue of the Occupational Safety and Health Act bill that is now before Parliament, because this is something that has been 20 odd years now in gestation and has not yet been finalized. And as a result of which, our workers would not have had the benefit of many of the provisions of the bill, because it is not yet law. And so that's one of the things that we would want to come out of this experience, this pandemic experience, that we actually do get that Occupational Safety and Health Act passed in Parliament. It also affected how people work, because we are accustomed to a kind of work setting, which is either in a factory kind of setting or an office setting. And whereas in the past we had the Flexible Work Arrangements Act being passed, I think our employers tended to focus on flexible working time rather than the whole gamut of flexible work arrangements. And so it tended to focus on extending a work day without overtime actually being incurred, rather than actually work as productively or even more productively in another kind of setting at home. And that I think the discussions will ensue, because a lot of workers who have been working from home find that it is a good experience for them. Some persons will say that they save, because when they look at the cost of travel to and from and lunch and what have you, as against the increase in their electricity rate, some will say that they have saved. I would believe employers would save by working from home in many instances as well. So that is something that I think that coming out of the COVID experience, we will have to explore some more. And probably one of the opportunities that can come from our COVID experiences is to look at the possibility of new jobs and how we look at current jobs as well. So that is something that I think we will have to delve deeper into as a nation as we come out of this initial phase of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Helena. I want to ask David this particular question, because I think we can't discuss COVID-19 and the labor market without a conversation on how the government reported each day on the numbers was that workplace cluster, and just what that did for employers. If you owned a business, if you were responsible for employees, I wonder, David, how did your your membership responded to a workplace cluster being identified and named that way in respect of the spread of the disease, and how did people then adjust behavior, and I suspect they did, given what the situation at Alorica taught the nation?
Well, let's answer it this way. I think a lot of employers were a bit uncomfortable with their name being put in the public domain like that, so that it can affect you if it were a retail business, it could have hurt your business even further. Thank goodness they don't have customers locally. But overall, I think there was discomfort in disclosing a company's name, because think about the Bull Bay situation, for example. We were never told what the name of the lady is, or in Clarendon. So yes, there was discomfort, but there's no easy way, because you want to be able to control the virus, of course. But I think at the bottom line, there are views both ways. I think it could have been done a little more anonymously than that. That's my view. And yes, there was discomfort expressed by my members.
But do you think it caused them to be a little bit more cautious and to take more precautions now in respect of their organizations, the capacity for spread within their organization? Did it have a positive impact, even in the midst of that discomfort?
If positive means greater push for compliance with all the protocols, yes, it did, because nobody wanted their company's name out there. Scotiabank had an incident, and it went public, not by the authorities, I don't think. It just went around the network, but it did cause a lot of companies. I don't want my company's name out there as having, a place for infection, so let us do what we need to do. Yes, it did affect them positively in terms of being compliant.
Okay, thanks, David. Caroline, I wanted to ask you, because I think part of what consumed public attention so much during the COVID-19, at least in the latter part, and just a little bit before, was the whole issue of Jamaican ship workers. I don't know that we knew that we had so many workers on ships globally. I certainly didn't know. I know that there were some Jamaicans who worked on ships, but that there was this significant amount of Jamaicans who were employed on ships around the globe was, I think, a mystery to a lot of Jamaicans. Can you kind of just summarize for us what are some of the things that we might have missed prior to COVID-19 about ship workers, about Jamaicans working on the high seas, and about our own preparedness perhaps for dealing with the reality of our Jamaican citizens who are working on the high seas?
Okay. Well, the shipping industry is very, if you're not in it, you don't know about it. So while it's billions and billions of dollars and a lot of activity going on, if you're not immediately, it's a very, what's the word I want? It's not visible. Even people going across the port, more passing the ports and so on, they don't really know as much what really is involved in shipping. We have different levels of workers, different types of workers. And the focus, I think, was on the cruise ship industry to a large extent. So we have seafarers that we call those who are involved in the operation of the ship. And then you have the people in the hospitality section, the entertainers, those in the bar, just like how you have a hotel or in the tourist industry on land, you have all those workers, because for example, a cruise ship is a floating city. So everything goes on a cruise ship. And the people who go to work, I'm not sure how the non-technical seafarers they do sometimes their own jobs or go through agencies. But I am not aware of. The Maritime Authority of Jamaica should have a registrar of seafarers, but those, as I said before, are the technical ones. Outside of that, I don't know where the numbers reside. So as I said before, the shipping industry is kind of invisible if you're not immediately involved. So that is why people would not know that we have so many workers at sea. And the issue as well with the, and that ship coming, it was with the cruise industry in particular, but we do have seafarers in other parts of the shipping industry. You have, tankers, we talk about transporting oil at sea. You see the containers pile up over the port. So we have seafarers in all different sectors of the shipping industry, even though the focus for this one in particular was those on cruise ship workers. And I could not tell you where there is a register of our workers. We know how many of them are going and where they are going. So perhaps that is something that we want to look at. I don't know if it's at the Ministry of Labour, but I know it's not at the Maritime Authority of Jamaica that keeps the register for, as I said, the more technical seafarers. The thing too is that with the particular incident, the ships, they agreed internationally, and the cruise company, to bring all their workers together and transport them, because borders were closed. People could not be flying in and out. So the problem was not just Jamaica, but it was what we could do given the context within which we had to operate, with other borders being closed and so on, and having to ensure that persons who are coming in were safe to come in. Right now, numbers have gone up. It's more than 400,000 seafarers are stranded in some country other than their home country. And there's a big international debate, and the International Transport Workers Federation, and I'm sure Jamaicans are in that 400,000, have given seafarers now the permission, so to speak, let's use that loosely, to stop working, to force countries and force discussions and to see how are we going to get these people home. Some seafarers are waiting to join ships to work and to relieve those who are on ships. Now for Jamaica, Jamaica is not necessarily responsible for Jamaican seafarers, and I'm using that loosely as well, who are working on ships that are not registered to Jamaica. And most of those ships, I don't know what the Jamaican registry is like, but international law, shipping law, says that it's where the ship is registered that is responsible for the workers on those ships. So that is the first thing. So what is happening internationally with where the ship is registered, where the owners are domiciled, where the management company is, that is the mechanism that should have been engaged to see how to get these people home. But ultimately they're Jamaicans, or ultimately you're a national of whatever country. And when that system fails, then it's for the country which you're a national of to step in. But again, as this was an unprecedented event and borders were closed, then it became a problem for basically everyone. And how do you get these people around the world, get them home or get them to their jobs, when you have countries, and some countries very adamant that they were not going to open their borders and they were not having the discussion. Everybody got really into their own silos and wanted to protect themselves rather than having the discussions at the international level. It's just now with the ITF forcing hands, so to speak, and employers, because they want their business to go on. So they also have a vested interest in getting seafarers moving. So they came together internationally and started speaking with specific countries, Singapore, Philippines, India, and those places where you have many seafarers and where you find seafarers going through a lot of those countries, to do something so that we can get the seafarers moving. So I don't know that Jamaica could have done much. We are a very, very, very small player in this international, in the international shipping industry. So I don't know that we could have done much. We don't know how many seafarers we have really and where they are. That might have been one of the greatest problems. to know who we have, where they are, and if we could have done something to get in touch with these people and say, how are you going to, or best for us to get you home, rather than wait until the company just herd all these people together and come knocking at your door and say, they're here.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Karen. I think that's an important issue for us to address, because I think it took us by surprise that we had so many seafarers. David, you had your hand up before we go back to Helene. David?
Yes, a quick point about this issue of the seafarers and the workers on the cruise ships. One of the things it makes crystal clear, there needs to be some mechanism, whether it's an amendment to our constitution or a treaty between all these countries through the International Seabed Authority that says if there is a pandemic declared by a government, it can delay the return of its nationals who request a return to the country in the interest of the greater good of the country. Because it's a shame that those people couldn't be allowed back immediately, because they have a right to get here if they want to. But a decision was taken to delay it because of the pandemic. So I'm saying we need to have a clear thing that says pandemic is declared, the government has the option to delay the return of citizens who want to come home. But you can't just leave it to judgment like that. That's it.
Okay, thank you, David. Helene, I guess when David spoke a while ago, there was something that I thought of, and it's part of it is, so Caroline and I talk about this all the time, this issue of representation and workers' rights. And even in the situation of Alaric, I remember on TV one evening, I noticed a story about some young women at that same call center who had concerns about their safety in the workplace, and their best bet was to invite in a television station or to talk on radio about what they were encountering. In other words, they had no space to speak to the issues that they felt were impacting them as workers. And what I thought at the time was, what has happened to our unions? And I know the nature of work has changed, and we spoke about even before COVID-19 in terms of security of tenure, in terms of workers working on contract and so on. But, what are unions doing to respond to the changing dynamics of work, to ensure that workers are able to access representation, or at least have somebody hear them out when they feel as if their rights are being trampled on?
Oh, well, I think you touched on a part of it, in that one of the problems that we have had certainly since the early 90s, and it is not just a Jamaica situation, it's a worldwide situation where how work is organized has changed dramatically. Whereas post the Industrial Revolution, you would have had a number of factories being established, and work was organized on a factory floor kind of setting where you had several workers, hundreds of workers coming together. That was able to spawn the trade union movement worldwide, because you would have had situations where workers work together, recognize that they have similar problems, and they would agree to come together to be able to solve those problems. Because, just by virtue of the term union, what we're talking about is unity of purpose, etc. But once that organization changed, it put a lot of pressure on unions to be able to continue to attract members in. The other problem that we have had is the fact that workers of today don't necessarily think like workers of the past. So workers of today tend to be more individualistic. You don't get so many workers wanting to come together to defend a cause for one. I remember when I was a young worker, just joined the government service. If you touch one, it meant you touch all. That's how we thought, and that's how we operated. We don't get that kind of thing coming because I think it's part of the way we are socialized now. So, I mean, when we were children, you would have ring games and so, which meant people had to come together to even play. A lot of our children really are in contact with each other through the use of various devices and through various platforms, and so that tends to be how they are organized. So we therefore have to be able to adjust our systems to enable them to feel as comfortable as in the trade union setting as they would if you had a group of them in a particular group in Instagram, WhatsApp, what have you. So we now have had to be changing how we organize, how we even meet, because we used to depend a lot on face-to-face meetings. As unions, we recognize that when we call workers out to meetings, they're not so willing and eager to come to meetings. And so what we have had to be establishing are the WhatsApp chat groups and various other platforms to be able to keep ourselves connected and united. Also, I think the fact that we had gone into the era of contract employment, which really places workers in precarious employment, because security of tenure is something that they are not now accustomed to in this kind of organization, has meant that a lot of workers tend to be very wary, almost afraid of being identified with a union. So when you go in to organize, until you can get to a stage where you have members signed up, and at that stage, if you have members signed up, if an employer seeks to terminate the worker, then we can have a case for union busting, which we can take through the courts, etc. But you have difficulty just getting workers wanting to sign up. So we are still at this point in time trying to establish a floor in terms of employment legislation, which will make it clear that workers have that right. Although the Labor Relations and Industrial Disputes Act does say that workers have a right to join the union of their choice, because we were recognizing that a number of workers were still sort of wary and afraid. One of the things that we had to do is to agree to an amendment of the Labor Relations Act to have workers who are non-unionized have access to the to the Industrial Disputes Tribunal. In the past, you would have access to the tribunal only if you were unionized. Now the law is that you can have access, and as a result of which, we have a class of workers, a class of officers who call themselves industrial relations consultants, that any individual employee who feels aggrieved and who wants to have representation can actually get the services of an industrial relations consultant, most of whom are union officers who are also employed in various unions. But that was a means of being able to ensure that the workers have access to the service, while at the same time satisfying them in terms of their continued employment. So it's a situation, as I said, that's a worldwide situation, and that is something that we are working to overcome by virtue of amending and adjusting the services that we provide, how we provide those services, making it more welcoming to younger workers. Because most of the persons that we're talking about are really young workers. If you're looking at our call centers, we're talking about mainly school leavers who are going in, and they are the ones who we feel are being exploited. So apart from that, the other thing that we have been able to do is to lobby for various laws to be put in place or amendments to legislation to be made, because the legislation will cover the workers whether they are unionized or not. And so as a result of which we would have ended up with the various minimum wage orders in respect of, say, household workers and also our security guards, because we had problems unionizing them, but we recognize that they have particular problems. And outside of that, we have a mechanism that we call joint industrial councils that are also able to deal with workers who are employed in those precarious circumstances by employers where the employers come together. So rather than negotiating with individual employers, we would negotiate with almost a conglomerate of employers and develop basic rates that will apply to employees in those sectors.
So Nadeen, this is Judith. Could I make a
Yes,
comment?
Judith. Yes, Judith, go ahead.
Thank you, Helene. Now, you see how much we've learned about how different aspects of industrial relations work takes place in Jamaica, which I think is not generally known, right? So thank you, Helene. What occurs to me though, I've listened to some of the people in the leadership in other BPOs, and they quite often correct people that say BPO. They say, no, it's a global industry. So they call themselves global business something. And I think certainly those of us who are interested in what happens in the labor market, in particular because there are sections of the labor market where women are at risk, more at risk than young men because of various reasons. I think one of the things we need to do is to inform ourselves more about the global model, because it's a model which the big conglomerates will look for countries which they feel can best meet the needs of that model. And I don't think we know enough about it. A lot was exposed because of COVID, for which a lot of people suffered, etc. But I think it was a learning moment. And I certainly have started to read a lot more about this global model so that we can then say to the government, yes, you may plan your employment strategy for the next 20 years around this model, but we need to talk about what the model really is bringing into Jamaica. What are the real benefits to workers, the conditions of work, because we know that the need for work is so bad. It's so grievous. So young people jump at any opportunity to go and work. And then when they get in there and discover how unkind, let me be very generous, the conditions of work are, they can make progress, but let's just talk about some of the basic conditions. Then it's a surprise. So I'm just thinking we need to do a lot more public education about the benefits and the drawbacks of working in this global model, because that's what it is. And it's going to be with us. It's not going to go away because it provides jobs.
Caroline, you literally put up your finger. There's actually a race on the feature.
I was going to ask where the put my hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Caroline.
Yes, I was agreeing with Judith about it being a global model, and that is what usually happens. You know, these multinationals go around the world and they find the weakest link. So that's the model that we have had coming out of the garment sector, coming out of when work was less, when there was less service work, more factory work, and so on. So it's basically the same model, neoliberalism, which promotes individualism, and hence the problems that unions are having to organize people, flexible work, which started out as discussing it's going to benefit employers and employees, but it turned out to be a way to keep employees from accessing a lot of the rights that were gained earlier when, you know, in the 60s, 70s coming up. So it is a global model, and she's correct. We have to understand it, because what happens is that it comes to our shores, and the idea is, oh, jobs are being created, and we should be grateful to have these jobs, and the numbers are about how many persons are employed, but the quality of the work becomes the problem, and it is as if we're not supposed to talk about it because people are being employed.
Yeah. I think those things, and I want to turn to you next, David, because in my thinking through of some of these issues, I'm thinking how much the world of work, David, you hearing? The world
Yes,
of work,
I'm hearing.
how much the world of work has now changed, and how workers seem to be almost like they're sitting on this knife edge, and it's almost as if the way employers are operating, it's almost as if they no longer need the worker. And so one of the things that struck me, David, about COVID-19, and after we closed down, especially tourism, was just how quickly, and it wasn't, I know it wasn't particular to Jamaica, but Jamaica is my reference point, how quickly it is that we were talking about people facing starvation, people at the point where they could no longer survive. And Helene said it a while ago, we live month to month. And I'm wondering about the sustainability of work and employment. I don't know that there's another option, but does it make sense, David, as an employer looking on? You're not looking on, you're involved in this process of putting people to work. Does work make sense in this time? If it is that people cannot even sustain themselves after
Well,
giving best part of their day and their lives to work, how can we say that work makes sense?
all right. Yeah, I view it somewhat differently, Nadine. Think about, say, the hotel business. Think about sandals. You've seen them advertising long before the government said that they're going to open, right? They are anxious to get back to the resort and hospitality business. They cannot do that without a workforce. I I have a different view than you that employers want to make money on their investment, of course, but it cannot be done without workers, whether you're on the spot or you're remote, because a workforce, an employment situation needs workers. Whether they can be made into remote workers and be productive, or whether they stay on site and follow get in compliance with infection control. There's no doubt in my mind workers are necessary, and employers are feeling the pinch from the lack of return on investment right now, from not having a full workforce back to get back in business in some cases. I mean, I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, I'm just wondering then, how come employers are not sharing the wealth? How come they're not looking out for their employees if they value their employees and they know that the employees are of value to their success? That's what I'm saying. People are not being paid in a sustainable way. The exchange for the payment for labor doesn't speak to that recognition on the part of those who own and operate wealth and are employers, that workers are giving the best part of their day and the best part of their lives to organizations. I just feel it's no more than ever a predatory relationship.
Well, let's break it down this way. The issue of not paying you fairly for the job you do, I think that's one element. And in some cases, yes, that is taking place. But I can also tell you that this morning I was talking to one of the major banks, one of the top three, and they told me that, listen, we have taken the position that during COVID, we're not reducing employment, and we're trying to increase employment because we're going to find new business opportunities. One of the major banks, one of the top three. So I cite that example to say, you can't broad brush all the employers to say that they view workers as a commodity. They view them as expendable. They view them as something that you trade as frequently as you can, because there are examples of companies who have made the commitment. It's not just them. I've spoken to other companies, not as big a name as them, who said we're keeping our workers during this COVID period because we're committed to them. We have some work to do in terms of the inadequate pay for some positions. But at the same time, let's remember we're operating a marketplace. And if there's an oversupply of the people available to do the job that you have to do, that compensation will tend to be lower because you operate in a marketplace. And there, you know, it's not like there was 7% unemployment before COVID. And still, that's too much. If you are in a situation like in some countries with 2% unemployment, there is a fight. There's a bidding up of labor because you can't get the workers. You can't get enough workers. We're not yet in that position, but I think it's a mixed bag. And yes, there are some issues, but I wouldn't want you to broad brush all employers that way. That's what I have to say, Nadeen.
Okay, thank you, David. I didn't necessarily mean all of them, but just generally our description of work now, and you know what we've been talking about. You know, it brings to me a kind of a need for a renegotiation, a sitting down, perhaps a social partnership, where employers and unions. Helen always talks about the tripartite arrangement, and government can sit and really talk about how people can live sustainable lives, because certainly it would seem to me that the creation of a super rich class and the ever increasing amount of people in the lower classes who are living off starvation wages and are eating food that makes them more susceptible to NCDs and more susceptible to then contracting diseases like COVID-19, who live in unhealthy housing arrangements, who cannot find help to take care of their children, that these and whose children are being uneducated in some of the more concerning, let me say that, educational institutions in Jamaica, suggests to me, David, that in let's start with our country if it's a global thing, that there needs to be a sitting down and on the part of employers and unions and the government, and talking about how do we create a partnership that creates more sustainable kinds of arrangement for our citizens.
Can I just respond quickly?
Yeah.
There will always be someone somewhere who says I'm not being paid enough for the job I'm doing, and we have to deal with that. But here is where I want us to go. I want employers and employees to be constantly speaking, especially to those at the lowest level of the organization. How are we going to upskill you so that you can earn more money rather than us always having a debate of what your existing jobs were? That's where I want us to go, so that the employers as well as the workers take some interest in how do I get upskilled so I can get a higher paying job and I can move up the ladder, and let the young person coming out of school take my job, which is demands less skill. You know, that's where I want us to be.
Nadeen.
Yes, Helene, and then Carol.
I think what we have to acknowledge is that, as I think Judith said earlier, we have to recognize that what is happening in Jamaica is no different. It's a global model, and it goes all the way back to the 70s, the 80s, and 90s. You will find employers, and not just employers, but those who hold the reins of capital across the world. They tend to be very united in their approaches. So we would have seen the approaches of the 80s, where what it was about is making sure that you disinvest in your social sector, and you privatize and allow the private sector to be the engine of growth, and all of those are things that we in the Caribbean would have seen the very same policies. They would have been implemented at different times, but as night followed day, Once you had it in one territory, it was going to come to all the other territories. This thing about, they call it global services. And of course, we would be told that you have different levels, and Jamaica is at the lowest level, which is the BPO level, which is really primarily about call centers. But according to them, you have different levels, and you can talk about legal services, outsourcing health, whatever it is, and those may be a little bit higher. So you realize that the owners of capital are always seeking ways to gain their wealth, with it costing them less. And that is what part of the problem that we are having right across the world, which is about the tension between capital and labor and how we are able to accomplish what we would want. I think though that some of the work that's actually being done and has been done at the ILO is instructive, and if we really, for governments and the other social partners are really serious about it, we can actually come out of it with understandings and agreements as to how we can address the issues. One of the first things which came out of the policies of the 80s, I think we used to call, what was that? That resulted in the WTO being given preeminence right across the globe. The first thing that we said we needed as a tripartite at the level of the ILO to look at was what is what we call decent work. So it's not just work at any cost and that you must be happy because you have a work. Decent work is what one of the things that came out of the ILO. Another thing that came out of the ILO was the multinational declaration, MNE declaration, which is really an attempt to get multinational enterprises who operate right across the globe and in many instances are exploiting labor right across the globe. Recognize the declaration is an attempt to get them to accept that they have a responsibility in terms of what happens in the social spheres in all the countries across the world. And if we can actually get programs coming out of that declaration where the multinational enterprises, employers generally actually take responsibility and recognize that we're living in a world in which each of us has to survive. And to the extent that any of us is in danger, all of us is in danger. And this pandemic really shows it, because at the end of the day, the persons who are less able to are the ones that are going to be more affected. But at the end of the day, those who are better off really need the services of those who are less well off, but are more vulnerable to situations like the pandemic. So we have to recognize that we live off of each other and that we need therefore to come together, recognizing that each of us have different agendas, but there's some space for us to coalesce, to be able to get something going so that each of us is able to survive and to thrive. And that's really what the position of the tripartite in the ILO is expected to achieve, which of course leads us right into the development goals as well, because all of these are linked. And I think COVID has sort of intervened, but what we have to be careful of is that it does not throw onto the back burner all of these things that were happening. So the Convention 189, 190 that was dealing with violence and harassment in the world of work, we cannot afford to allow it to be placed on the back burner. So now that we have come through this first phase and we're now moving into this phase of living with COVID, we have to get back to these other things, because if we don't solve some of these problems that the pandemic hasn't created the problems, all it has done is to show up exactly where we were prior to the pandemic. What we have to do now is to work to use our experience to make sure that all of the things that we had identified before and that we were working on, we actually don't allow them to get onto the back burner. Because if we leave it to some of our employer friends, their thinking is this is what it is about, and it is about the business is surviving, not so much about how the workers survive in the current sphere.
Can I say something?
Yes, Caroline, yes, and then we go to you, Carol, yes.
Yeah, just to add to that, and also the Employers Federation person I said about workers, government and employers coming together is very, very, very important, because if we look at the history, remember the history of the ILO, it was formed, there was the Spanish flu pandemic going on at the time and World War I, and labor, they realized that labor had to come into the discussion, and they had to provide a certain, let's just use decent work loosely, to prevent revolutions from taking place and total annihilation. So, and same thing after World War II as well. The ILO was reaffirmed, and its tenets were reaffirmed going forward, because there's always a recognition coming out of catastrophes that labor is important and the voice of labor is important. But as we have seen as well, when things settle down and everything is okay and hunky-dory, the capital, let's use that again, decides that it's going to go its way and try and get as much out of workers for as little as they want to put in. So all we're dealing with now, the lack of training, work is no longer lifetime employment where you go to an organization, you give your loyalty, you get promoted and so on. It's a hustling type of an employment environment. No, you do your training, you spend your money on your education, you come to work for me, ready to work. And I do little or no training, and I take you on the periphery. I might have co-workers, a few, but I take you on the periphery and I can discard you when I'm finished with you. We have to realize now, and I think the union should really capitalize on this, they can capitalize on it, that again we have had a worldwide situation, and it's going to take all parties coming together again to build back. And this time we must ensure that we do not do as we had done before, where when things start looking good again, then labor becomes the victim.
All right, thank you, Caroline. I want us to address, to take Carol, but there are some other issues that we need to raise before we end. So Carol and Lynette, and then we go back to talk about OSHA and, the decent work agenda. Carol.
Thank you, Nadeen, and everybody. So you're right where I was entering, Nadeen, because I'm kind of at the point of the so what. So the world has been brought to its knees by a virus that requires certain conditions to be spread, and that to the extent that those conditions continue to exist within human existence, it is the extent to which complete stop to the world and potential complete disruption to the global economy will remain a threat. So right now, our so what is, do we go back to leaving conditions, most people to operate in a condition that is conducive to virus spread and to social dislocation, social upheaval, etc., and therefore leave the situation to be one in which all parties, capital, labor, everybody is at risk? Or are we going to learn the lesson and say, especially at the level of the state, that the model of development that we've been pursuing needs recalibration, and we don't have to invent any wheel, because we have a set of sustainable development goals as a framework. We have a set of ILO agreements as a framework that stand in complete opposition, or not in opposition, but as a counter model to the ones we have been pursuing. So now I think we have to say to our governments collectively, which model you're choosing, because the one that we had has now been unmasked for how unsustainable it is and how risky it is to everybody. So do we now shift our attention collectively as NGOs, individuals, academics, everybody, to begin to say, let us be moving in the path that, let us adopt and implement the measures and the strategies that have been outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals, that have been outlined by the ILO, that have been outlined around environmental sustainability, etc. Because that's how we're all going to be wealthy, healthy, and survive. So we need to choose, and in the choosing, it means that we're going to have to agree to very different distribution of our budgets, how we make up our budgets. Are we going to prioritize when we have to choose between a significant increase in the education budget to make back to school in September and a viable education system work? If we have to choose between moving the money in that direction or building the next leg of the highway, what we're gonna do? If we have to choose between having workers unable to come to work effectively post-COVID or when we're living with COVID, are we going to choose to leave them on their own to solve childcare, or we're going to put childcare as part of the business model so that our workers can come? If being on public transport, being left to public transport means that we are leaving our people to be in close proximity to each other and therefore at higher risk health-wise, is transportation going to be a business cost that we all will agree we will start to put into the business? I mean, I'm just saying that there are some practical decisions that COVID has brought us to have to now begin to make, because it's just a matter of survival. So quality society, are we going for childcare? Are we going for parental leave? Are we going for home-based work with the kind of support to home base? Who is going to cover the increased overheads when I move work to home? Are companies going to pay for the extra in light, in water, in all of these things? Or am I just expected to absorb these costs on behalf of the employer? And as you said, Nadeen, occupational health and safety has to take on a very different and broader meaning now. So what are we doing about the bill that's pending?
All right, Carl, thank you very much. Lynette, is Lynette still here? Lynette had her hand up at a point. Lynette, do you still want to talk? Go ahead, Lynette.
Thank you very much, panelists and everyone. I just want to make an observation and ask a question of the panelists. It seems one of the conclusions I've come to from listening to this panel is that being invited to participate is quite a different thing from having power. I think that we have allowed ourselves to be lulled into the view that if we sit at a table with the different centers of power, it means we have power. But it does not, it clearly does not mean that, because look at where the worker is, look at where women are. And the question that I wanted to ask each panelist is, if you had a choice, what is the single most important reform that you would want to see happen in the labor market at this stage? Anyone, and be as specific as you can, please.
Okay. I'll ask, Carolyn, you look like you're chomping at the bit, so go ahead with that. And then I also want your comments on OSHA. I know you said you've been to one of the sessions, but as it is now, the bill before Parliament, is there anything we need to do to it now? Or should we just go ahead? Should we encourage going ahead with the passage of OSHA? And Lynette's question, of course.
Yes, let me go with the OSHA first. I read through it quite quickly, and it seemed to be good enough, especially when you compare it to even some of the other countries. And the right to refuse is also in it, which is not even in some of the others. But remember, that was being done without a pandemic, without the situation. But I'm a little hesitant to say, because perhaps what we should do is get it done and then do amendments, or how they have when we're doing regulations, so get it done, and then in the regulations that will give it teeth, we can add some of the things that COVID has turned up, rather than delay it, because it's a little tricky that way. In terms of the one thing, what I would probably want to see really is more union. Well, employers stop being afraid of unions and recognize that the workers' voices is very, very important, especially in rebuilding, and embrace unionization and have the tripartite discussion so that everybody can benefit.
David, before Helene, could you answer that question about what reform you would like to see?
Yeah, the single most important one in my view, is the whole issue of technology. Make sure that the island-wide infrastructure on internet, for example, is robust enough to support remote working in as many places as possible, as well as education from remote areas. We have seen recently that access to reliable technology is one of the impediments of getting more students to be able to work remotely and continue classes so you keep safe. So that to me is one of the most important ones, to support work habits, remote working, as well as education remotely. That's it.
Okay, thanks, David. Helene? Helene?
I'm unmuted now, yes. I think what we have to recognize in terms of labor market reform is that as unions, we had put forward that issue as something that needed to be addressed. One of the things that we had identified very early is that we had a first go at labor market reform that tended to focus on particular labor laws and changing them to meet what were the current demands at that time, which would have been somewhere in the 90s. We now have a report from the Labor Market Reform Commission that had been appointed probably 5 years ago, and we have the commission's report. The chairman of that commission was actually Dr. Marshall Hall, and it was, they looked at all the aspects of the labor market, from the labor laws and regulations to employment to social protection, all the elements of the labor market. Training was also there as well. Where we are now is that report has been handed in, and I think it has been sent on to cabinet, and what we are awaiting now is the action plan as to how we are going to implement the recommendations of that commission. The commission, I think, was forward-looking. They actually dealt with the issues having to do with technology, how jobs are organized today as against how they were organized in the past. All of those were issues that were discussed, and in fact there were consultations with employers, unions, and anybody who was interested in the issue of labor market reform. For us as unions, probably the most important thing that could come out of it is an actual compendium of the labor laws under one heading, an employment law that would allow workers, employers, anybody was interested to be able to go to that law and be able to deal with any issue having to do with employment, be it trade union representation, be it anything having to do with rights at work, etc. All of that should be in one law. And importantly, based on some other legislation that exists, we think the issue of contract work would also have to come under there, and those are things that we expect will come out of the recommendations that are now before Cabinet for us to move forward.
Thank you very much, Helene. It would seem to me as well that some of the issues that we're now at 3:30, and David said he had to leave at exactly 3:30. But Carol raised the issue of care and the importance of employers starting to take responsibility for some of the care that becomes a part, or that is necessarily a part of people's lives, and one of the things I noticed the other day, and I'm sure Helene can speak to it as well, is that when this whole business of the work order was lifted, the issue of daycare centers and what happens with children was not something that was necessarily understood by some of our industry leaders as to how that plays a part in the lives of their employees. But also, what I thought at the time was how different workplaces would be if they took those needs of their employees into consideration. If mothers and fathers who had children could work in environments that took note of that fact and could help them to deal with the challenges that they encountered around childcare. I also think that one of the things that we haven't addressed, and somebody had asked a question about it earlier, was the level of informality that we experience in this country, as also as that relates to domestic workers, and we had addressed the whole issue of domestic workers in a way earlier. And I think that is something for us to consider. One of the things I had thought about at the start of this was this idea of a decent work agenda for Jamaica. And I've been hearing people using decent work so loosely, but I don't think we've sat down and talked about and identified what would be on this agenda. What are our asks on this decent work agenda? What would we require of government, of employers? What would we require of industry players in respect of what would be on this decent work agenda? I think it's an important point for us to note that we might not necessarily be speaking to our asks in a coherent kind of way. Like, we need to say exactly what is it that we require. And I think the decent work agenda, coming up with what are our asks, what are the things that we need for this decent work agenda to become a reality for us in Jamaica, is very, very important. And I think, Carol, some of the things you spoke about, I find quite instrumental and profound in respect of, just how work needs to be reorganized in this new post-COVID, living with COVID, going through COVID reality. What are some of the considerations? Does this development model work? Who does it suit? If it doesn't suit the majority of us, why do we continue with it? And we're now at 3:33 and the 1 hour is up. And so I'm going to ask Caroline, and yes, my granddaughter is right here as we talk about care, asking Caroline and Helene if they had any last words that they wanted to say, and anyone else as well, if you had anything you want to say, to just jump right in. But we have Caroline and Helene first.
Yes, I remember who had pointed out that we are not going to reinvent the wheel. We have models already. There's a lot of information, a lot of work done by the ILO. So we do have a definition for decent work, what a decent work agenda looks like, and the elements of this agenda. So I agree with you in terms of my final words on what we have been discussing, that in order for us to perhaps go forward, talking about all of this through the idea of developing a decent work agenda should be helpful, because it takes into consideration all the different elements that came up today.
And I would just add that this whole thing about decent work came really as a response to globalization. Because it was recognized that through globalization, the various neoliberal policies were being implemented right across the globe. And what the ILO director came up with is the notion of a fair globalization. And it was felt that decent work was the answer, or certainly one of the answers. And I think one of the important things about the definition of decent work and the decent work agenda is the recognition that when we speak about decent work, we're not only speaking about work at the workplace, but we're talking about the reality that the what decent work really takes into account issues like social protection for families, which would come right into what Carol was saying. So if you're talking about social protection for families, what we really have to be looking at is how we take care of our children and all the things that go with social protection as well. Health would be one of those as well, and freedom of people to express their concerns, to organize, etc. And also for personal development and social integration, because some of the times when people speak about work, they're just thinking about locating the worker in the workplace, not recognizing that the work is supposed to be providing the worker with all the things that make their lives give them better livelihoods then. And so that being the case, these are some of the things that we talk about when we're speaking about decent work. And the truth is that that agenda, the ILO has started some of the work in Jamaica by they now have a project that is being implemented through the Ministry of Labor, looking at moving people from informality to formality, because it's recognized that in informal, when you have the economy being almost predominated by informal, the informal economy, then really what you have is situations where the decent work agenda can be pushed off, pushed to the side, and instead people only really are concerned about making the last dollar. And so one of the issues is to bring them into formality so that you can deal with that. So I think as Carolyn says, the decent work agenda, certainly as promoted by the ILO and its various partners, we're quite clear as to what it is. What we really need to do is to get the word out to the rest of the society, so that it is not just about what the social partners, the traditional social partners are agreed around, is something that has to get to the wider society. Because if we're looking at employers, you know, the vast majority of employers are really not in the Employers Federation, private sector organization, etc., because so many of our employers are actually in the informal sector. So those are things that I think we have to be very clear on. And just to indicate that coming out of the calls that we made in respect of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, we did get a meeting of the committee that advises the Minister of Labor. We did get that meeting on, and arising out of that, the Parliament, the Joint Select Committee of Parliament has actually reconvened, and I think they have had 3 meetings so far. What I'm understanding is that they're at a stage where they're going through point by point, section by section, having accepted the presentations and submissions from various groups and interested parties. But we are still saying to them that they need to move with haste, such that we can get that law on the books to be able to protect workers at work.
Thank you. Thank you, Helene. I don't know if anybody else, I know some of the comments that are here and notice Lynette's comments about gender issues being muted on this panel. And she says she's not sure that the report of the labor market reform speaks to reform of the lopsided gender characteristics of the market. And she says it will be flagged as a follow-up. Lynette, I know what I had here is the matter of Jamaica's equal pay legislation and reform of that, and a policy to support equal pay legislation. Certainly, I think that's something that has to be addressed as soon as possible. I think yesterday, I don't know how many of you tuned into the sexual harassment bill being debated in Parliament. I was totally taken aback by the posturing of the Minister of Justice on some of the issues raised. Just generally, the legislators were pretty poor, except for Pavan Gale, who postured very differently, male and female alike, and I can't remember her name now. But for the most part, the legislators were their posturing was pretty pathetic around this issue of sexual harassment. But I think that's something for us to pay attention to and to join in the conversation that is happening around that. And I think the issue of parental leave, I think Carol had raised that issue, and childcare and employers' obligation to the employees around childcare is something that I think we need to speak to and introduce into the conversation. I hear the need for us to pay attention again to OSHA and what's happening with OSHA, and for us to perhaps dig up the Hall report, the labor market report, and to see what is in it, and to look at the contents and to start asking for it to become again a part of the broad conversation of how we go back, or not go back, but how we continue to deal with the realities of COVID-19, and perhaps, you know, see what transformation is possible as we try to do things differently in a more sustainable way. Carol Watson says we also have to discuss the proliferation of use of independent contractors in an attempt to subvert workers' rights and deny them benefits under the law. A whole lot of issues. I don't know. Let me look at the other comments and see if
While you're looking, Nadine, I think one thing that we as this group that we may want to concentrate on is getting the government to some kind of advocacy to get the government to ratify Convention 190, violence and harassment in the world of work. I think there's only one country so far in the world that has ratified, and I am involved through Public Services International, and we are trying to get as many countries of the world as possible to ratify that convention. So that, I think, is some advocacy that we need to begin doing to get that the government to ratify.
Okay. All right, it's now 3:42. I want to thank all of you for participating, for being a part of this Zoom chat. I don't know if you will be able to continue next week, but there will be another conversation. I think this next week, the panel chair will be in the McClymont Lafayette, and she'll be looking at sustainable development, I think. And so we ask you to join us again next week, same time, same place. Of course, information will be sent for you to join us in another conversation. I think Lynette is saying here, the panel should make recommendations for the training and recruitment of women in the construction sector, since we will be left as women to hold red and green flags of the higher paid jobs, and also quotas for employment of women. And I think that's a fair comment, Lynette, since as construction is perhaps the only sector one of the only sectors that remained unaffected by the pandemic in many ways. Special concession was made for contract workers to go back to work long before many other sectors. So that is an important reality for us to pay attention to. Thank you all so very much for being here. And thank you very much to Helene Davis-White, Caroline Graham, and David Wan, who had to leave us earlier, for their frank and open discussions this evening and the issues that were brought in our 1 hour and 15 minutes of discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This was very, very educational. I learned a lot in this
Very
session.
good.
Thanks
Enjoy
to
the rest
our
of your day.
Much more to be done.
Much more. Much more.
How much more work? Wow.
You ready, Judith? You ready for the work, Judith?
I'm trying.
Yeah.
Gone though, bye.
All right, Judith.